Now let's take a look at something called backup and recovery. This is really part of architecture because it also furthers our understanding of how the data files, the log files, the archive logs, and the control files all fit together. They're all linked together. The control file points at everything, and it basically contains pointers as a record telling the database processes where each file set is. So logging records every transaction in redo log files. The log writer process takes every entry that's put into the redo log buffer by any change to the database, be it a change applied before a commit or as a result of a rollback. Those changes will be written to the log buffer, which, when the log buffer gets to a certain point, controlled by various configuration aspects within Oracle itself, that log buffer will be written out to the log files. Archiving stores old redo log files. As I said before, there are so many redo log files in a database. If I go into the database, now select star from vlog. These are the redo log files in my database. Well, in this case, actually the redo log groups, because you can actually put multiple log files into each redo log group. In this case, this is a very small default installed database. There's only one file per group, and there's only 3 files. The idea is that you can actually create duplicate files in the same group and put them on separate disk spaces, which means you're actually creating multiple copies of the redo log. That makes the database more recoverable. It's safer. And then archiving, when you run out of redo logs, in other words, in my default database, I have 3 redo log files. So when all 3 redo log files are filled up, the database will cycle back to the first one. But before it overwrites or starts to overwrite the first one, it has to copy the first file to an archive. So I get my first archive file. That's how the log files and the archive files work. The recoverability is based on the existence of the logs, the redo logs, the online redo logs, and the archives or histories of the redo log files. The logs and the archives, if you retain those files for the lifetime of the database, contain all the changes in the database. In theory, you could create the database as it was with the initial setup, and you could recover it ahead from 5 years ago if you really kept all that data, depending on how busy and active your database was. You don't want to do that. You want to back it up in between quite a lot. The control files coordinate between all the log files and the data files using file pointers. Those file pointers point at the data files, the log files, and the archives. So now let's look at some pretty pictures just to demonstrate how all this works. Here I've got a picture of a database with, if you like, system data, index, and temp table spaces, all stored in the data store. Here's the redo logs pointing off from the data files, and the archive logs the data files get written to. They include both system data, application data, indexes, temporary, and rollback, and the control files are linked to the database as well. So everything's contained in the database. As you can see here, for backup processing, in other words, taking a copy of your database so that you could recover it later on, the control files point to the data files, the redo logs, and the archive logs, and the flow of data goes from data files to redo logs to archive logs. In a recovery situation, again we've got the same pointer structure, but the data files can be recovered applying changes from both or either the archive logs and the redo logs. This movie has given you more insight into control files and how the control files link with pointers to data files, redo logs, and archive logs, and how the data flows through the system between the data files, redo logs, and archive logs. If you want to know more about Oracle Backup, in the documentation go into the master book list. What I do is I simply search for the word backup. Here we go. The backup and recovery reference guide, the backup and recovery user reference or user guide, user's guide. I wouldn't look at the reference first. Reference is going to give you things that don't make sense to start with. So you look at the user's guide. It will tell you how backup works. And the basic thing to do is always go and look at the introduction, or actually the better thing to do would be to look at the overview. Introduction, which is exactly where it goes anyway. So lots of information there, but not required for this course, but it's there.